If you were a gamer in the late 90s or the early 2000s, chances are you played at least one James Bond video game out there. And there's a lot of them, from impactful cultural phenomenons to games that were so good for absolutely no reason, and even games you thought were really good but are actually downright terrible. And I just played and ranked every single one of them. I'm giving one title the S+ ranking and deeming the best James Bond video game of all time, and giving one the F- ranking to call the objective worst game in the franchise as well. I want to make it clear that I am a very casual James Bond fan. I've probably watched half the movies from old and new. That being said, some of the James Bond purists and gamers out there may disagree with this video at some point, so go ahead and drop your favorite and least favorite Bond title down below as well. I'm linking all the pre-1991 Bond games into one group, and that's because 1, there are a ton of them, and 2, I couldn't get them to work half the time. A lot of these games are on the Atari and ZX Spectrum, meaning they have that terrible audio that just sounds like robot farts. Oh, what's the matter? You didn't hear the James Bond theme in there? Because it's there, apparently. You have a view to a kill, which honestly just looks like a jelly bean traversing through a maze. And that maze also makes no sense. Like, these arrows point to other arrows, which point to the opposite direction. I had no idea what the objective was here. Then you have the Living Daylights, which is kind of like Duck Hunt, but also has levels that has a high score. Also didn't really understand this one. But the one that was the most confusing was Shaken Not Stirred, and this is a text-to-action game, which I am not familiar with whatsoever. This was way before my time, and I really just couldn't comprehend what was going on. I picked my items, and then I was given a blank screen where I could still text, and I would try. Naturally, I tried just like every option out there. But didn't get any type of response, not even like an error message or like any type of validation that my request was going through. Also, I'm pretty sure this game didn't even get the licensing for James Bond, so that certainly nullifies it for this list, just like everything else I just talked about, because these are just so obsolete and so irrelevant that I doubt anyone even watching this played them. So if you actually got to play these games when they came out, please let me know your experience down below. I'm leaving them unranked. On to James Bond Jr., which as far as I'm concerned is the first somewhat full-fledged title in the Bond video game catalog. It's a Metroidvania with a lot more emphasis on platforming at times that is based off of a TV show that existed around the same time apparently. It's an animated TV show that takes place in the same universe as all the James Bond films, but apparently it's following James Bond's nephew, which for the sake of continuity definitely makes a lot more sense. The amount of nookie that James Bond has been crushing throughout his life, definitely there's at least like 10 James Bond Juniors that he doesn't even know about running around out there. As a casual fan, as stated before, I didn't even know this TV show existed. Apparently, it's by the same people who made Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, so the animation actually looks pretty cool. And if you ever got to watch this show on a side note, please let me know if it was good down below, because it had like 60 episodes, which is kind of a decent amount. I will tell you one thing I have a strong opinion about is that this game is terrible. You have the NES and the SNES version, which came out within a year of each other, if I'm not mistaken. And they are completely different games. It's definitely not a port whatsoever. The NES is all platforming and Metroidvania, honestly way more leaning into the platforming side of things. And then the SNES version was platforming, and then there's also the shoot 'em up levels, which kind of gives a little like diversity in the gameplay. And these are so different enough that they probably deserve a separate ranking, but I coincidentally just dislike both of them equally. One of those shoot 'em up levels from the SNES is the very first level, and this level just overstays its welcome. And since you die in one hit, it's literally like Flappy Bird levels of frustrating. And I hope you're used to long levels, because that's all these games are. Once you get to the Metroidvania sections, you're just traversing a huge maze, and in the NES version you're just traversing this huge level, defusing rockets on the first level. And once you get to those rockets, you have to defuse them. You have to do this extremely difficult puzzle, by the way. But if that wasn't frustrating enough, then this audio plays, which I don't know who passed this off as like, yeah, this is what the player wants to hear. The fuck? And on top of that, you have these super slippery controls that make things, like simple things like getting off of a platform to another platform, like not even jumping, difficult. Enemies are just bullet sponges that take a bunch of shots to kill. The jumping feels so inconsistent. Sometimes you'll jump super high, and a lot of that, like on the springs, you have to like jump over to a certain level and time that jump, and it just doesn't go as high as you need it to go. And then you'll get stuck in these like infinite death vortexes, like where you just bounce and bounce and bounce, and you can't do anything about it, which also was not fun. Ironically enough, the most fun part about both of these games is probably the shoot 'em up levels. I say the most fun saying like it wasn't terrible, but still not like actually fun. Obviously for the NES and SNES, there's tons of games that are just only shoot 'em ups, and they do this way better. And then on the other hand, you also have like Metroid and Castlevania, which is what this game is trying to be, which is also just way better. So yeah, the SNES version might have two different types of gameplay, but it does neither one right. That being said, both these games are D tier. I don't recommend playing either one. I think they're equally terrible. James Bond: The Duel is an original story, if you want to even call it that, that technically caps off the Timothy Dalton era of the franchise. It too is a Metroidvania without any other level types to offer. And right off the bat, this is definitely superior than James Bond Jr., but not like by a landslide by any means. There's only 4 levels in the game, and you just go around each level freeing X amount of Bond girls, then arming a bomb and escaping the level. Like I said, the controls are much better here, so I actually like somewhat enjoyed my playthrough of this, but still it is, you know, outshined by games like Metroid and Castlevania. This game is exclusive to the Sega Genesis and Master System, and if you had this growing up, it was probably a good time, but no reason to go back to it. It's a sequel. This is the game that most people think of when they hear James Bond and video game in the same sentence. And trigger warning, my perception of this game is probably going to piss you off in some way. None other than Rare was set on to take the task of a James Bond movie tie-in FPS game, and they knocked it out of the park. Arguably one of the most influential games of all time for bringing a first-person shooter experience to consoles, but raising the bar even further by implementing a seamless and fleshed out local multiplayer experience as well. This leap forward in gaming history was very important and I think paved the way for other games like Halo to be where they are today. However, I don't think this game aged as well as people say it has. This game is good, do not get that twisted whatsoever, but the controls are not as seamless as you thought they were in like today's standards. And that makes sense. This game is like almost 30 years old. There's no reason it should compare to the like controls we have today, but this is not better than any modern FPS by any means. I mean, dude, have you seen the Nintendo 64 controller? These controls aren't bad. I'd even go as far as calling them decent. This is like a huge personal bias for me because I never got to play this game when it came out. By this time I'd already played like newer James Bond games. I mean, these games like came out I think when I was like 2 years old, but playing this game years after at my cousin's house was pretty fun, but I had already played other, and dare I say it, better Bond games at this time, so that kind of spoiled the fun and like novelty behind this game that a lot of people have for it. So needless to say, I was never a Goldeneye glazer. It sounds like I don't like this game, which couldn't be further from the truth. I think this game introduced new concepts that other studios have built upon and made better, and as far as being a Bond game, it does everything well. Gadgets, stealth, gunplay, and even elements that would become normal to the franchise moving forward, like harder difficulties introducing more objectives to finish levels. And on top of that, there are tons of secrets and cheat codes that can be unlocked by beating certain missions on certain difficulties within a certain time, which further catapults this game as an influential game because, as you know, this game has a huge cult following for speedrunning. Honestly, not even cult following, and maybe it was a cult following back then, but now it is like definitely a major game for speedrunners. And since speedrunning wasn't a thing back then, this kind of like helped catapult that. A lot of people say this is one of the best FPS games out there, and most people would say this is the best James Bond game out there, which I have to disagree with that. And again, that's probably a personal bias. I still think this game is great. It is an A tier. To follow up the smash hit that was Goldeneye, just a year later, we got James Bond 007 for the Game Boy Advance. And this game sticks out like a sore thumb when compared to other games on this list. For starters, it's a top-down experience, and usually when you see a game like this, you think of like Legend of Zelda or Pokemon, and it doesn't necessarily fit like either of those games, probably like more so like Legend of Zelda when it comes to action-adventure and like finding key items and whatnot. There's some puzzle solving. You also have like linear missions with an open world format, meaning you go talk and interact with NPCs that give you unique dialogue that help you like find out what you're supposed to do. But I'll be honest, this game was pretty damn good for what it was. Even with the hardware at the time, especially for being a handheld, this is nothing close to a movie tie-in cash grab. Sapphire, the dev team that made this game, really put their whole heart and soul into this project and resulted in a hidden gem. The only complaint I have with this game is like when you need to find something, you just spam the interact button with like everything around you, like walls, beds, everything. Like I don't know how you're supposed to like figure that out on your own. I had to do like look up a lot of like tutorials on how to complete this game. And then the combat's a little repetitive, but again, this is a 1998 Game Boy game, so I mean, what can you really do with that? I think this was just like a handful of months after the success of Goldeneye. Goldeneye definitely buried this game's existence. Would I go back and play it? Definitely not, but if you're an avid Bond fan, I totally recommend this. Still, it's very far from perfect, but I'm giving it a C tier. On to another movie tie-in game, being Tomorrow Never Dies, the first third-person shooter or action-adventure game in the franchise that was exclusive to the PlayStation 1 and would kickstart the EA era of Bond games. And let's just say this game would see a similar fate to the movie it's based upon. With missions and even cutscenes straight from the movie, this game is insanely simple. Missions can be completed in like 10 minutes or less and have absolutely no meaning to them. The controls take a lot of getting used to, which makes sense since the PlayStation 1 didn't have analog sticks. So with that, simple tasks like even just walking through doorways was very hard. I will say the gunplay itself really wasn't all that bad. The lock-on mechanic, although clunky, made shooting enemies much easier. There's also gadgets in this game, which for the most part, like, you might as well not even have to equip them because all you do is just have it out and then like press the interact button to use it. Like, you don't even aim it or do anything else aside from that like you would in Goldeneye. Then you also have a couple boss fights that are just bullet sponge enemies, which can feel also very repetitive. A lot of people like really hate this game, and it's pretty bad. I don't think it's as bad as everyone says. It's still definitely a D tier, which leads us to a very rare instance where you have to actually ask yourself, is the game worse than the movie, or is the movie worse than the game? The World Is Not Enough for the N64 is a game that a lot of people would see as just like more GoldenEye since it's on the exact same console, but this actually couldn't be further from the truth. One obvious reason for that is that it's a completely different movie, but the really important piece of information here is that this is where EA got the licensing to Bond, and in turn, Rareware had absolutely nothing to do with this game, which I don't know why they made that decision because GoldenEye was a cultural phenomenon, smash hit, but this is just the world we live in, and maybe that world isn't enough. Since EA now has their mitts on the IP, the game would see two different versions, one being the N64 and the other being the PS1. N64 is being developed by Eurocom and the PS1 being by Black Ops Entertainment. I played roughly like half of the PS1 version of this game, and it is way different and for all the wrong reasons. This game suffers from horrible AI, like it is very glitchy. The game itself is just glitchy in general, like sometimes like you get stuck on missions. The missions are also different from The World Is Not Enough. They're like loosely based off of the similar settings and whatnot, but some missions scrapped entirely while there's other missions in place of that, which doesn't really make a lot of sense. This one's a D tier, but we'll go to the N64 version, which I actually really liked. And honestly, this is somewhat of a spiritual successor to GoldenEye. People seem to be pretty harsh on this title, and I think a lot of it comes from like the GoldenEye purists out there. But I can tell you up front, this game is definitely not as good as GoldenEye, but it's still very fun. Very similar gunplay and mechanics. You also have like the higher difficulty gives more objectives. I will say there is this skiing mission that is terrible. I thought the controls would be like as good as GoldenEye, but this mission single-handedly proves that wrong. If this mission didn't exist, this game would probably just as good as GoldenEye, but that is not the case. Controls are terrible. It also is just way too long, and if you die, you have to restart from the beginning, which is very frustrating. Overall, The World Is Not Enough is just a lesser version of GoldenEye, and that is fine. Fine enough to get itself a B tier ranking. 007 Racing was caught in the crossfire of the whole like my IP needs a racing game, and of all the franchises to have one, I think 007 is like the last one that needed one. I don't want to spend too much time on this game. It's like universally despised by everybody out there. You go through levels that involve you driving, and for the most part doesn't really have much to do with racing, which would also like make a lot of sense because James Bond races cars like not very often. It's usually like a chase. Very rarely is it ever a race. Instead, this game is more of a twisted metal experience with levels involving destroying other vehicles and completing other objectives, which honestly isn't a terrible idea. That happens enough in the movies to where you could like make a game around it, but the controls in this game are all-time terrible, and also I don't really care about graphics, but this game literally looks like dog barf. It is terrible. So when you're playing like a dog barf looking game with dog barf controls, it's a terrible experience. Skip this game. It's one of, but not the worst in the franchise. It gets an F tier. Agent Under Fire was the first 007 game to graze the 6th generation of consoles, and it was a smash hit. Spoiler alert, this 6th generation era of Bond games is top notch.
Your interview with Ms. Malprave has been
Whoa,
delayed.
double
In the
trouble.
meantime, you can enjoy the view.
Damn.
I already am.
Oh, James. Tagging on yet another FPS to the franchise, this game saw a new Bond that is somewhat similar to Pierce Brosnan, but different enough to make him not, since this was time where like his contract had expired. I'm not sure if his contract expired, but there was some type of like legal issue to where they couldn't have Pierce Brosnan's likeness in this game. The gameplay is similar enough to GoldenEye, but I think these controls are actually way more fleshed out. There's a lot of driving in this game, and it feels so smooth. And while we're on the topic of controls, the only problem I had with controls is when you were cycling through gadgets. I don't know why this was just so painfully difficult. Like it would go when you wouldn't want to go, and then it would keep going when you would like stop cycling through them. I just think a pause menu would have done a lot of justice in this regard. But other than that, the aiming and gunplay and everything else about controls is very good. The level design for this game is one of 3 things. You have those driving missions where you just like, you know, maybe you destroy something or just try to get to the end of the level. Those on-rail segments, which are actually pretty fun, like very responsive. Or what the majority of the game is the first-person perspective where you go, you know, through a mission, complete objectives, get to the end of the level. You know, higher difficulty has more objectives. But this game introduced the Bond moments, which is probably the best thing about the Bond games that I can think of. The Bond moments basically are just alternate approaches or like special little things you can do to make the level easier that you don't necessarily have to do to beat the level, but are very fun. They tell you how many there are in each level, and you can go back and try and do all of them in this single playthrough, which gives this game a lot of replayability, similar to how Goldeneye was. Also, to my understanding, this is the first game, aside from like Bond Jr., I guess, that got like its very own story from the ground up, not based on anything from a movie. It is totally like, you know, it's got the whole cheesy antagonist, nuclear destruction, so on and so forth. I mean, it's nothing crazy, but it is every bit of a Bond story. I will say the stealth didn't feel like it played too much of a role in this game, since for the most part, just going in guns a-blazing didn't affect anything about the level. By the way, I actually never played this game. My first Bond game was not this. But this is a very short and sweet experience. Apparently, the development for this game was an absolute hellscape, and the fact that it came out in this state was like a miracle. And I think that's also why this game is really short. I think I beat it in like 2 or 3 hours. But this game reminded me a lot of the next entry on this list. But regardless, this is a Bond game that everybody should play. It is an A tier. Nostalgia is a very powerful entity, and the influence that 007 NIGHTFIRE had on me as a kid was insane.
Dude, that's literally what I would do as a kid on this mission.
Yeah, some things never change. This was one of the very first video games I can ever remember playing, and in turn was also my very first FPS game and also my very first Bond game. So sorry if I'm a little biased behind this next entry. NIGHTFIRE takes that same gameplay loop from Agent Under Fire and just refines it. The cycling between gadgets for one thing has become much more seamless, and I couldn't even tell you why that is. I just know that when playing this game, going through gadgets was a lot easier, even though it was like the exact same way it was in the first one. Also, this game sees the same exact 3 formats where, you know, driving or on rails or first person. The levels have a little more depth to them, specifically the first person perspective levels. I think they have like probably double the amount of content that the ones in Agent Under Fire had. And also, unlike Agent Under Fire, this game actually gets to use Pierce Brosnan's name, image, and likeness in this game. However, Pierce Brosnan did not come back to voice it, but everything else about this is Pierce Brosnan. NIGHTFIRE also has one of my favorite opening missions of any game, because the very first objective, like most objectives in the game, gives you multiple options of how you want to approach it, which helps the player understand that there's no right or wrong way to play this game. Also, as I just said, I normally don't care about graphics in games, but Agent Under Fire and even more so NIGHTFIRE have pretty dang good graphics. And where I think it really shines is NIGHTFIRE's underwater car mission. And also, like Agent Under Fire, this is another original story with nuclear destruction, bad guys, Bond girls, you know, he's just drowning in it in this game.
James.
You're the deep cover agent?
If you liked Agent Under Fire, you will definitely like NIGHTFIRE. I do think it's a better version, not to undermine Agent Under Fire whatsoever. I just think there's more depth to NIGHTFIRE. Also, I even ran some multiplayer in this game with the bots just for old time's sake, and I will even go as far as say I think this is better than Goldeneye in that regard too. NIGHTFIRE is an S tier game, and it takes everything good about the Bond games so far and just makes the perfect game, but still not the best in the franchise. I always thought the NIGHTFIRE PC port was just a port, but this is a whole other game I discovered after recording this video. And I'll be completely transparent with you guys, I only played the first mission of this game because of how bad it was. Developed by Gearbox and running on an early version of the Source engine, it sounds like a dream come true for any first-person shooter enjoyer. Unfortunately, that dream became a nightmare. The games are very different from each other for a lot of reasons. There's no pre-credit tutorial level. As a matter of fact, the opening mission is the closest similarity between the two games, and even that's different. Same objectives are here, but a different layout. Obviously, the game runs on a totally different engine that gives the game a totally different feel, and not in a good way. The way to sum it up, it feels like a shitty Scary mod map that was made by a 12-year-old. The gunplay is bad, AI doesn't react to you, and there are no driving missions whatsoever. The laundry list goes on and on from there. Apparently, this game has a cult following for its online scene, and that's why it was so easy to get your hands on to play. But if you even give this game a try, it will piss you off knowing the perfection of NIGHTFIRE on consoles exists. It's crazy to see how PC version of a game be inferior to a console version, because usually it's the other way around, and this is a perfect example of that. It is a D tier. Everything or Nothing is the first third-person game in the Bond series. First good third-person perspective game in the series. It too tells an original story using not only the Pierce Brosnan likeness, but this time his voice as well. As a matter of fact, most Bond actors reprise their role for this game for one last hurrah as the Brosnan era for Bond. On top of that, you also get Heidi Klum as a Bond girl and Willem Dafoe as the antagonist for this game. Yeah, I mean, they really just put their dicks on the table for this one. And even the fan favorite villain Jaws makes a return for this game. For the sake of continuity, makes no sense, but it, I am so down. First things first, the gameplay is much different than the previous two titles for obvious reasons, being that it's in the third person perspective. But then on top of that, this mission structure is also pretty different. For starters, there are a handful of missions that involve getting in a vehicle and actually getting out and doing something else. Before it was just like, you know, you're in the car the whole time or you're on foot the whole time. There's like a little bit of both. I mean, it's very like brief sequences where you go between the two, but still, the driving in this game is all-time clean, and there are now motorcycle missions that too are equally clean and satisfying. Another huge difference between these games is the length. There are a whopping 29 missions in this game compared to like 12 missions in NIGHTFIRE, and I think like maybe 10 in Agent Under Fire. But I will say that number can sound a little misleading. There are some missions in this game that are like the MI6 interludes where it's just a cutscene, and others where they're just like super short. I mean, like 3 or 4 minute missions if you really just kind of like run right through them. But this game is still very long in comparison. You still use those gadgets, but not as much as you would in the last 2 games. You have the Q Spider, which is pretty much only used for Bond moments, and I think the majority of the gadget use outside of the rope is making the combat and gameplay easier and not necessarily used for like to progress the missions. Anyways, combat has changed to a cover shooter with lock-on mechanics, and if I had to critique this game in any way, it would be those lock-on controls being inconsistent. Sometimes they're very clean and sleek, other times it's like you're like fighting over who you want to like lock onto, but those moments are few and far between, if I'm being honest. Moving on to the levels, I mean, they're pretty good. Like, some are short, like I said, but the settings for levels are pretty varied, and some of these levels are reused later on because you're like backtracking, but they're not reused like so cheaply. Like, the objective is so different that you kind of forget you're playing on a reused level sometimes. Unfortunately, the multiplayer, which includes an entire co-op campaign, is bound to split screen with no bot support, and there's also like even a racing mode, which looks pretty enticing. But once again, I have nobody to play that with, so I had to leave that out of this review. If someone has strong opinions, please let me know. It sounds like it'd be really fun with this game. But all in all, this is the greatest James Bond experience for a video game, and it gets the S+ ranking for this video. In some ways, I think third person kind of fits the Bond vibe a little bit better. This game has a good amount of content, half of which, like I said, I didn't even get to experience for this game, but the campaign being like double in length from the other 2 games is just such a win. You ever have those vague childhood memories that you couldn't remember if they were actually real or not? That is the existence of Goldeneye Rogue Agent for me. Not to be confused with the N64 title. As a matter of fact, this game has next to nothing to do with that game. The only thing this game has to do with the name Goldeneye is that you play as the MI6 agent Goldeneye. I remember one of the neighborhood kids being like, yo, I got this new James Bond game where James Bond dies and you play as like another agent. I was like, no way, they can't do that. And then sure enough, I went to a friend's house and then I saw this. Yeah, that's like the first level, and they just brush over this. They barely even talk about it, but yeah, James Bond dies in the first like 2 minutes of this game. Anyways, Goldeneye is blamed for his death and is kicked out of MI6 and is then recruited by Goldfinger to go on a revenge tour. This game was part of that era where like anti-heroes and like edgy darkness was like the play. I don't know why we went through this era, but this is basically the Sonic the Hedgehog game, but for 007. Enough about the story, let's get to the gameplay, which sucks. There's practically no use of gadgets, and the game has completely transformed into like an FPS only with a big focus on combat, which would be fine if the combat were good. Dual wielding is back, and this is one of the focal points for the gunplay, which I did like, but what I didn't like was the ammo system. Instead of like getting reserve ammo, you just pick up another version of the gun and it restocks the gun. It really made no sense. The aim assist and aiming in general felt off and a step back from the other 2 Bond FPS games of this generation. Every mission is also just super long and basically just running from A to B, killing everything, and maybe a boss fight or 2 here and there. The gadgets are also replaced with your Goldeneye, and yes, that's the only reason they can call this game Goldeneye, because your character has like an actual golden eye. Anyways, this gives your guy like cyborg powers that don't really help all that much. I actually do really like the idea of playing as like an agent gone rogue, but the execution here just wasn't there. Although the combat is a focal point, it genuinely feels clunky, inorganic, and flat out worse. The level design has no structure and overstays its welcome, and even the cutscenes and overall graphics just look like PlayStation 1 graphics. They look like twice as bad as the games before this. Hey, at least we got Christopher Lee coming back as the man with the golden gun, am I right? This game was for sure misleading. I mean, people definitely saw Goldeneye 007 like on a box and was like, oh, this has to be a remake or like some type of successor to the game, and it just absolutely was not that. It's honestly impressive to see how EA can go from 3 like phenomenal and beloved games in the franchise to then this absolute dog water. I firmly think that this is the worst Bond game in the franchise, hence why it gets the F- ranking. So far, the 6th generation Bond games have been nothing but original stories. And with the exception of Rogue Agent, these games have been pretty damn good and beloved. And now imagine you take that framework you use for these original stories and apply it to one of the most beloved Bond movies out there. Enter From Russia with Love. Sean Connery is back to reprise his role as Bond, this time in a third-person shooter that is once again developed by EA. With similar gameplay to Everything or Nothing, this is yet another solid experience. A few new mechanics that I enjoyed about this game that help it stand out on its own was the gunplay, and it added this like advanced mode where it like shows the weak points or like trigger points for your enemy. Things like shooting off a grenade from a holster or like shooting off armor from a heavy enemy. That was pretty cool. The overall lock-on system and controls just felt better in this game too than Everything or Nothing. Not by much, but just like a little more like sleek. Another new element was the upgrade system. In each level, you can perform moves or find research points that let you upgrade your guns and even gadgets. I do think the missions use a little more depth to them. They are consistently longer than Everything or Nothing, but the objective can be like a little stale sometimes. All in all, this is another pretty damn good Bond game. I think it's cool to see like this gameplay style be applied to a pre-existing movie, because so far it's all been original stories, and they did it justice pretty well. I mean, this game also looks very beautiful. It plays very well. It's a B tier. Quantum of Solace was one of the first Bond movies that I was old enough to remember the release of, maybe aside from Casino Royale. With that in mind, I was pretty excited when I got this game for Christmas on my Wii. And like the movie, this game is just so damn mid. The Wii version is probably the worst version out there because of the motion controls, but I actually played the PS2 version for this video, and I actually don't know which version is more lukewarm. Apparently, there's a lot of differences between the two, enough to probably give it another ranking, but I've played the Wii version so long ago, it's pretty obsolete at this point. I probably played the game like 3 or 4 times. When I played the PS2 version, I was definitely like, this isn't what I remember. But we can go ahead and run through this game. It's very underwhelming. The missions are very dull. There's probably like 4 or 5 where all you do is chase somebody. Then you have these boss fights with like the quick time events that were just, you know, it's a quick time event. That's all I'm gonna say. The aiming mechanics are also pretty bad. They have this new like aim down system that it's honestly just all around worse. I don't even know how to describe it. It's supposed to like trigger your aim assist, but it doesn't really, so it just ends up being a very clunky disaster. And then the Wii version, I remember just, you know, it's motion controls, so there's that. Unfortunately, I didn't play the 360 or PS3 version, so I'm assuming those are the better versions of this game. The Metacritic would also say otherwise, so do with that as you will. There's also no incentive to stealth or any driving or any like gadget use for that matter. And it's clear to see that this is where like movie tie-in games were just getting out of hand, and this is exactly what that is. It's a movie tie-in cash grab, and it's pretty damn terrible. It's a D tier. Goldeneye, nope, not that one. No, not that one either. Goldeneye for the Wii, yes, this one was a remake or reimagining or remaster. Honestly, I don't even know what to call this one. It has the Daniel Craig Bond when he replays the movie, but pretty much everything about the location, setting, characters, and all of it was different. So I don't know what you want to call this game. It honestly leans more towards like a ROM hack or like a fan-made fever dream. On paper, this sounds like a total cash grab, and since there's already bad vibes with reusing this game's title in a misleading way, I was pretty weary of this game going into it. On the Wii, nonetheless. I quickly realized you can play this game in its entirety with a GameCube controller, so that was a huge sigh of relief. And I also realized this game was pretty good. A lot of the charm like gadgets and driving have been removed and just been replaced with Call of Duty. I really don't know how else to describe this game other than a linear A to B style levels that just involve killing everything in your path. There's some stealth, but again, you don't really have to do it. It's really, you're just better off just killing everything. I mean, they even have like the breach and clear segments from MW2 just ripped straight from that game. If you're looking for a faithful remaster of GoldenEye for the Nintendo 64, this will not tickle that itch. But if you want a James Bond Call of Duty campaign, it will tickle that itch for sure. This is a B tier game. It also did get like a reloaded version a year later on the PS3 and 360. And by the looks of it, these graphics are pretty nice. I didn't get to experience that one, but from what I understand, it is the exact same game, just like on a better engine, or better graphics rather. But regardless, pretty solid game. 007 Bloodstone was the game that got brushed over due to its simultaneous release with 007 GoldenEye for the Wii. So much so that I brushed it over for this video. I actually got to play this game roughly within the launch window, but did not play it for this video, so it's not like really fresh on my mind. So with that, this is also abandonware, and it's pretty hard to get your hands on, so I know that this is super lame of me to do, but I'm leaving this one unranked like the Atari games. I know it's seen as a hidden gem for a lot of people, so I apologize in advance for those who really enjoyed this game, but I don't think it's fair for me to comment on this when I haven't played it in recent memory. On to 007 Legends, which is kind of similar to this GoldenEye reloaded Wii extravaganza version. It's basically like Skyfall. When he falls off, he like kind of relives all these Bond moments, but they're all the Bond moments from like the old movies, and this game is terrible. If they literally just used the exact same engine as the reloaded version of Bond GoldenEye, like this could have been good, but it was not. Extremely horrible controls, and just like honestly, the graphics aren't even really all that good either for like being a newer game. And the easiest way to sum this up is this is the PS1 version of The World Is Not Enough, but in a modern perspective. And for the sake of continuity, it is kind of weird seeing Daniel Craig play like every old James Bond. And it's also really weird because like the GoldenEye remake, he's using like modern technology in movies that took place like in the 70s and 60s and stuff, which kind of was weird. This was a really lazy game. There's only like 6 missions, and like I said, they don't connect to each other because they're all from different eras of Bond. It is another terrible game. It gets an F ranking. Again, not the worst Bond game out there, but damn near. But that is every James Bond game ranked. This is our final list right here. If you disagree with it, which I know you do somewhere, definitely, please let me know down below. What's your favorite? What's your least favorite? I would love to know. If you want to see me rank every Far Cry game or every Lord of the Rings game, click on screen now. And if you liked, leave a like. If you didn't, leave a dislike. And thank you so much for watching.